was 10 when I was deported to the first concentration camp. I was 13, and liberation, I was 15. So that's roughly, I think, the ages that you yourselves are now, and so maybe that helps identify. So this story goes back almost 80 years ago, and you might ask, why am I telling this story today when it's almost ancient history? Well, it is and it isn't, because now in our own country and in other parts of the world, we see echoes of the Holocaust and such phenomena as white supremacy, ethnic cleansing, voter restrictions, closing libraries, banning books, separating children from their families. Those are very familiar features of the Holocaust, and that is why it's so important that you learn about it, that you take it seriously, and that everyone does whatever they can to prevent this from ever happening again. So when a group is targeted for discrimination, then usually they are labeled. The Nazis called the Jews thieves, criminals, pigs, all kinds of other cockroaches, all kinds of other nasty words as a form of propaganda, so that as many people as possible will start hating the Jews. And so today we hear some of those labels again. And I've heard refugees being referred to as animals or terrorists. Now, when these labels were applied to my family in Germany, gave me a reason to show you some photos of my family and what they looked like. So the first slide, please. First slide actually is a map, and that'll give you an idea of the journey that my family and I were forced to take in the period from 1937 actually, till 45 when we were liberated. So I was born in Berlin and grew up with my parents, my loving parents, my brother, 2 years older than I, and I was even lucky enough to live in the same house as my grandparents. And I had an idyllic childhood, and I'll talk more about that. From Berlin, in order to escape Hitler, we moved to Amsterdam. It was not by choice, but it was actually by force, so we could escape the Nazi persecution of the Jews. In Amsterdam, we lived for 2 years peacefully, and then the Nazis occupied Holland, and they took over the government, and the persecution of the Jews continued. So then we lived in Amsterdam until we were deported to the first concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen, which was a concentration camp in Holland, and then after some 8 months, deported to Bergen-Belsen, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, which was in Germany. And we were there for almost 1 year, barely surviving. And then we managed to be included in what's called an exchange transport, and were sent by train from Bergen-Belsen to Switzerland. From Switzerland, I was deported to North Africa, Algiers, to a refugee camp in that part of the world, where I also stayed for 1 year. and then finally came to America on Christmas Eve of 1945. So that gives you an idea of all the places that we were forced to travel to, not by choice, but by command. So the next slide shows you some pictures of my family. These were my parents, their wedding picture. The next one is a photo of my brother and I. He was 2 years older than I, so he was about 3 and I was about 1. And the next slide is a picture of my father and me. I was about 5 years old. I adored my father. I can't remember him ever scolding me or punishing me for anything. They had such a very loving relationship, and I admired him. He was my hero. The next slide. These are my grandparents. My grandfather holding my brother as an infant, and my grandmother holding me as a baby. And we were really spoiled by these grandparents. They took us on trips. They gave us all kinds of treats. And I have really wonderful memories of growing up with their love and their care and all the fun we had together. The next slide. Well, here we are already in Amsterdam. Now, I have to explain that my grandfather owned a bank in Berlin, and my father was the partner in the bank. And then the time came when the Nazis declared that Jews were no longer allowed to own banks, and the bank was taken away. And so my father became unemployed, and that was one reason for my family moving to Amsterdam, where he was looking for a job, and also as an attempt to escape Hitler. So my father found a job with the American Express Company in Amsterdam. He couldn't come back to Berlin. It wasn't safe. It wasn't certain that the Germans would let him out again. So my mother had to get everything ready for leaving our home, our belongings, and getting ready for the move to Amsterdam. Now the sad part was that my grandparents were not allowed to come with us. And so that was the first breakup in our family, which was very, very sad. So here we are in Amsterdam, living in this apartment house on the 3rd floor, and next to it is a picture of the home where Anne Frank lived. Some of you may have heard of her. She belonged to a family that also left Germany in order to try to escape Hitler, and the family settled in Amsterdam. We lived in the same neighborhood. She wrote, the Frank family ended up hiding, and so during the hiding, Anne Frank wrote a diary, which became very famous. And I read some time ago that other than the Bible, Anne Frank's diary sold more copies than any other book. Was translated into dozens of different languages, and if you haven't read it, you might enjoy picking it up someday. So Anne Frank lived in the same neighborhood. And the next slide shows a typical school picture taken of all the students in Dutch schools. And I think this is about 3rd grade. Anna and I didn't go to the same schools, but she has very similar type of picture taken in her school, sitting at a school bench with a notebook, pen in the hand, and some kind of a picture behind. The next slide shows one of the many restrictions imposed when the Nazis took over the government in Holland. And it says here, Jews are forbidden to enter. And this is a sign at one of the central parks in Amsterdam. And this kind of a sign was shown in many different places in the city, because Jews couldn't go to movie houses, they couldn't go to theaters, they couldn't go to movies, they couldn't go to parks, they couldn't go to swimming pools. They were forbidden to go many, many places. And some of the other restrictions were that friends who were not Jewish were not allowed to visit us in our home, and we weren't allowed to visit friends who were not Jewish in their homes. We had a curfew, 8 o'clock every night, we had to be home. And also, we had to wear the Star of David, the Jewish star, on the left side of our garments at all times when we were not at home, so that everyone could see that we were Jewish. And of course, there was a lot of propaganda against the Jews. Now, some of the other restrictions were that we couldn't go to the food stores until after 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This was a time of war, and there were many scarcities. So when you went to the food store after 3 o'clock, often there wasn't any food left over. We also were not allowed public transportation. We couldn't use any public transportation. And then the Nazis confiscated the bicycles from all the Jews. So that was another restriction, because if you can't use public transportation and you don't have a bicycle, then the only place you can go to is where you can walk to, and that is another limitation. Let me see, in addition to that, those were the main restrictions. Oh yes, there was one more. Jewish students were exiled from the public schools. I could no longer go to the school where I had gone the first 6 years of my life. I had to go to a Jewish school with Jewish teachers and only Jewish students. And that school was it was further away from where I lived and from where the public school was. And that's the only school I was able to attend. But of course, beyond all these restrictions, which made life very difficult, the worst was that Jews were being deported to concentration camps. And this happened at quite a speed, so that, for example, in my school, the Jewish school, almost every day there was a student who didn't come to school anymore. The school bench was empty because that family had been deported, and gradually more and more kids did not attend the school anymore. And it was a very difficult time, because sometimes they would just deport part of the family and then somebody would be left. And you knew eventually your turn would come. Now the next slide. So this is an example of how the Nazis deported the Jewish people. It's called a razzia. And the way this was conducted is they would block off an entire neighborhood, and they would get everybody off the street. Nobody could be out on the street. And then they would go from house to house and from door to door, and they would find the Jews. And if they found a Jewish family, they gave you 10 minutes to pack your belongings, and you could only take with you what you could carry, either in a backpack or a suitcase or a bundle. And here you see all kinds of people, older people, children, baby carriages, all kinds of people carrying whatever they could take with them that they could gather in 10 minutes. Think about if you were in that situation and you had 10 minutes to pack, probably never coming back to your home. What would you take? What are you going to select? What are your favorite possessions? And what could you carry with you? Well, these were all the questions that had to be faced when they came to your door and they deported you. And then when you left your apartment, they would seal it and nobody could ever enter it. And then at some point the Nazis came with a big truck and they confiscated all your belongings. So you would certainly never see them again. So this was the razzia. Now on the left side you see 2 cups, and they were coffee cups. And those are the neighbors who are sitting across the street, and they're watching what's going on there, how the Jews are being deported. And they're sitting there drinking their coffee. And that's what you call a bystander. People who watch something horrible going on and not doing anything about it, and just having their regular cup of coffee in the morning. And that's part of that picture. The next slide. So after the Nazis rounded up all the Jews in the neighborhood, they would come with trucks, and they would load us all on trucks and take us to the railway station. And this is what we found on the railway station. There was a long, long cattle car train, and that's how the Jews were sent to the concentration camp. Not in passenger trains, but in cattle car trains, and they would squeeze 60, 70 people in a wagon like this, sitting on the floor. Sometimes there wasn't even enough space on the floor for everybody to sit down, and people had to sit on each other's laps. And there was no food, there was no water, there was no toilet. And then when the wagon was full, then they would close the doors and they would lock them, and there wasn't even any air because these wagons had no windows. And this is how people were transported to the concentration camp. Now, in our case, we were sent to Westerbork, and there was about 6 hours on the train getting us to Westerbork. But many people from Westerbork or from their home or other place would be sent to a death camp in Eastern Europe, and they might be on a train for 3, 4, 5 days, locked up without air. And some people would even die on the train before they got to the camp because it was such a horrible experience to be in these cattle cars. Now the next slide gives you an idea of the camp Westerbork. On the left side you see all the barracks. They were lined up close to one another. And on the right side you see the interior of the barracks. They had 3-tiered steel-framed bunk beds. The only thing you could find on your bunk bed would be a straw mattress. And then, since there were 3 beds, you were entitled to 1/3 of the floor under the bed to keep your belongings. And the barracks were crowded, and they weren't comfortable, and people, there were a lot of fights between people about space and about window and about all kinds of things. So that was the interior of the barrack. Now, life in Westerbork was not as bad as it would turn out to be later. The adults had to work. There were all kinds of jobs, mostly having to do with the maintenance of the camp. My brother had a job as a messenger boy. He was given a bicycle so he could bring messengers from one side of the camp to another. And I was too young. There was no schooling for kids my age. There was really nothing to do. There was no playground. There were no books. There were no art materials. There was practically nothing to do. And life, the way I remembered, was boredom. Was really boring, except for one event that happened every week. And that was, the camp was situated on two sides of a railway track. And every Saturday afternoon, a cattle car train pulled in, and it sat there all day, the rest of Saturday, and all day Sunday, and all day Monday. This ominous train that you couldn't help seeing it wherever you went in the camp. And Monday night at 11 o'clock, like clockwork, every week, the barrack leaders would turn on the light and they would read the names of the people who had to go on that train. And that train took the Jews to the death camps in Eastern Europe. And Westerbork was just a transit camp. People did not really stay there very long, and so eventually you knew that you were going to be deported. And so this was a very traumatic experience, that every Saturday afternoon that train would pull in. You didn't know if your name was going to be on the list, and it was going to be read. And then if Tuesday morning the train left, and there was almost every time somebody to go on that train who was either a relative or a friend or a neighbor, somebody who was dear to you, and then they would have to leave. My family would usually get dressed. After the names were read, we would go to the other barracks where we had friends or relatives, and then we would, if they had to go, if their name was on the list, we would stay for the rest of the night and walk with them to the train and say goodbye and know that most likely you would never see each other again. So that was the trauma of Westerbork. Other than that, we had 3 meals. The food wasn't lavish, it wasn't what my mother cooked, but it was adequate, and we didn't starve. And we were allowed to receive packages from friends or relatives who were still in Amsterdam. If they had any food to spare, they could send us packages, and that was always a great delight to receive a package. And there was even a song made about receiving a package. Now, before we were deported to Westerbork, something happened that was very important to my family. And that was, my father met a friend on the street, and he had just received 2 passports, one for him, one for his wife, to Ecuador. And that was important because the Germans had an exchange policy where they were going to spare Jews who had a passport to an allied country so that they could exchange Jews for German prisoners of war or German citizens who had left Germany early in the century and settled in the Americas, and they were forced to come back to Germany to help win the war. And so this was the exchange policy. And so therefore there was the belief, if we could get passports to an allied country, then maybe we would not be sent to the gas chambers or killed in some other way. So my father received the information of the consul in Sweden who had sent those passports to his friend, and he rode away immediately. He sent 4 passport pictures. But the passports did not arrive before we were deported to Westerbork. However, after we had been in Westerbork for 4 months, we received a package. It was forwarded from our home address, and it contained 4 passports to Ecuador. And those passports had played a big role in saving the life of my family, my own life. So the next slide here shows you the passport and the passport picture. Next slide. So because we had these passports, we were eventually sent to Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen had what they called an exchange camp, where they kept Jews that they were planning to use for exchange, trading people, trading Jews for German citizens or German prisoners of war. And we were sent to Bergen-Belsen. And when we left Westerbork, we were told Bergen-Belsen would be a better camp. And also, we wouldn't be there very long because we were going to be exchanged. So this is what we saw when we arrived in Bergen-Belsen, a picture of the barracks. And then over there on the right side, you see people behind a barbed wire fence. That's what we saw when we first arrived there. And they had anxious expressions on their faces. They looked very skinny. The clothing they wore were like rags. And so it didn't look like this was a better camp at all. And so the barracks were very similar to the ones in Westerbork. And then on the top, on the left, you see what's called the Appellplatz. And that is where they took roll call. And that was a form of torture in Bergen-Belsen, because roll call meant being lined up in that big ground and standing in rows of 5. You couldn't move, you couldn't talk to anybody, you couldn't sit down on the ground. And sometimes the roll call would take hours and hours, rain or shine, snow or whatever the weather would be, snow or hail. And we would stand there for hours and hours. And this was every single day. And if the Nazis had a reason for punishment, they might do roll call even second time during the day. Well, the situation was like torture, because how could you stand for 5-6 hours in place without moving? One time I personally saw an elderly woman sit on the ground because she just couldn't stand up anymore. And the Nazi came and he beat her up, and he beat her to death. And that was supposed to be seen by everybody else, so you wouldn't dare to sit down on the ground because you saw what would happen to you. So that happened every day. And the conditions in Bergen-Belsen were atrocious. They were brutal. The adults had to do slave labor, get up very early every morning, leave the camp for whatever kind of labor they were assigned to, and not returning till evening. There wouldn't be any food. They would work the entire day. The Nazis would be there supervising. If you weren't industrious enough, they would beat you. The conditions were horrible. My father, he was involved in digging trenches and building new barracks as the population in the camp grew. My brother, as I said, he was 2 years older than I. He worked in what they called a shoe commando, where they had old shoes, worn out shoes, and they had to pull them apart and save the good leather and throw out the deteriorated leather. My mother did all kinds of sewing work, pulling apart underwear that was worn out and saving the pieces of fabric that were still usable. And for me, I didn't have to go to labor, but my duties were to help keep the barrack clean, to do the laundry for my family, doing laundry meant pulling clothes through cold water. There wasn't any soap. And hanging the clothes up outside where they had some clotheslines. And then I had to sit there till they were dry, because if I would leave the clothing on the line, I would never see them again. There was so much theft in the camp because nobody had what they needed. And so, of course, the temptation is that you steal it from other people who might not have any more than you have, but it's a matter of survival. So you just think about yourself and you don't think about other people. And in particular, people stole bread. Now, the food rations were minimal in Bergen-Belsen. We got a piece of bread that was about 3 inches wide, and that was supposed to last for the entire day. And then there was one meal in the evening, which consisted most of the time of turnips boiled in water. And if you were lucky, you found a little piece of potato, but that was very rare. And that was not enough nutrition for people to live on. So the death rate was very high, and people were malnourished, and there were all kinds of illnesses. Hygiene was very poor. My father developed pneumonia after we'd been there for a few months, and I don't know that he ever recovered from it. And there were other epidemics like typhus, cholera, polio, dysentery, and other kinds of diseases. And we all had lice, body lice. Everybody had lice. And these lice transmitted the diseases from one person to another. So there were epidemics. And many, many people died in Bergen-Belsen. So this gives you a description of what life was like. Now, one of the better things that I should mention is that I was always with my family. I was never separated from my parents and my brother. And that meant so much and many children were separated from their parents. And if I hadn't had my parents, I don't know if I would have been able to survive. Well, some other task for children my age was that I had to take care of the children whose parents were at labor all day. And that was a very sad kind of task because these children were very sad. They were scared. They were afraid their parents wouldn't come back. Sometimes they were sick and there wasn't any medication. And they were always hungry and we didn't have food to feed them. So to comfort these children was a real challenge. And that was my job every day. So this pretty much describes life in Bergen-Belsen. Now, my family was extremely lucky to be included in what was called an exchange transport, where in early January of 1945 there was a train, and we were supposed to be screened by a doctor, by a Nazi doctor. You had to appear there and he would look you over and decide whether you were going to be included or not. So first my brother and I went and we were checked off and approved for this transport. And then my mother had been sick for several months. She had been bedridden. And we tried to dress her and get her out of bed, but she collapsed, so she couldn't go. And then my father came back from labor, and he really looked like something awful had happened to him. And he looked sick, and he was very tired, and he said he couldn't go to be screened by the doctor. So after he rested for a while, and my brother and I begged him, he allowed me to take him to the doctor. So he was leaning heavily on my shoulder, and we walked there, and the doctor asked him, "Are you sick?" And he said, "No." And then he looked at me, and by some magic, he checked off my mother's name, and so we were checked so that the four of us could leave the camp the next day. And luckily we found some friends who were willing to carry my mother to the train because she couldn't walk anymore. And eventually we were all settled on the train. And so there's the next slide. And here you see two people had to be sharing a bed. And this shows my pink blanket, and that's kind of a symbol because this was the blanket I had as a young child, and it came with me to Amsterdam. And then I had it in my backpack and took it to the camps. And this was available to me, and I always curled up in it when I needed comfort. And so here you see that as the population in the camp increased, two people had to share a bed. So my brother and my father shared a bed, and my mother and I shared a bed. And we all lived so close to one another that the diseases were rampant. And in the end, every day, every night, I went to sleep hoping I would wake up the next morning. And when I woke up the next morning, usually I was surrounded by people who had died during the night. At that stage, most people could not survive. So the next slide. And so here you see the Red Cross train. This is a picture that a student drew. This is the good train that liberated us from Bergen-Belsen. And when we saw it was a Red Cross train, we had hope that we were really going to get out of Germany. And here you see a railroad station in a town called Biberach. Well, the train stopped there. The train made many stops on the way to Switzerland. But the second night on the train, my father died. And we were so close to freedom, and he couldn't make it. So his body was taken off the train at this railroad station and put on a bench. And my mother, my brother, and I had no choice but to leave him there and to continue the journey to Switzerland. And so after 2 more days, we reached the border between Germany and Switzerland. And the exchange took place there in a little town called Kreuzlingen. It was in the night. On one side of the railroad track was the train from Bergen-Belsen, and the other side was a train with people, German people, who were forced to go back to Germany, and that's where the exchange took place. And so Biberach was one of the places we always remembered. So when we came to Switzerland, my mother and my brother were hospitalized immediately. My mother was very, very ill, and my brother also. and so they were taken to a hospital, but I wasn't allowed to stay with them. And so other people from Bergen-Belsen, including myself, were sent to this refugee camp in Algiers in North Africa. So my father had just died, and now I was separated from my mother and my brother, not only because we lived in a different city or a different country, we now lived on different continents. The war wasn't yet over, and it took several months until I received a telegram that told me that my mother and my brother were recovering. They were still alive and they were recovering. So all that time, I didn't know what had happened to them. But here we were in this camp, and we had a lot of freedom. Well, first of all, we had sheets on the beds. We had 3 meals a day. We had freedom. We could play games. We could take a bus to a nearby city. This camp was located on top of a hill, and when you walked down the hill, there was a beautiful beach of the Mediterranean Sea, and when the weather got warm enough, we could be there anytime, and this actually is where I learned to swim in the Mediterranean in 1945. Now, this picture shows, just happen to have, these are the only pictures I have of the camp in Algiers. And so the one on the left side on top is with some friends. You can see the barracks look different here. And then on the right side, people my age would hang out together and either go to the beach or go to the movies in the nearby town, or as I said, we had freedom. Now, I ended up staying in this camp for almost 1 year. In the meantime, of course, I was hoping to be reunited with my mother and my brother. I was hoping they could come to Algiers, or I could go back to Switzerland to be with them, but that didn't happen. And so eventually, in December of 1945, I was able to get transport to America. Now, we had relatives in the United States, and they were able to provide the affidavits so we could come to America. And so when I arrived in America, I lived with these cousins of my mother, and it took 6 more months before my mother and my brother got the visas to come to the United States. So altogether, I was separated from them for 18 months. And when I hear and see what's going on at the borders of our country in Texas and Arizona, where children are separated from their families, it gives me nightmares to think that here we're 80 years after the Holocaust, and these horrible things are still happening. Children being separated from their parents, not even knowing where their parents are going to be. So that is a very stark reminder. But I lived with these wonderful relatives, and they helped me adjust to a new life in America. First of all, I didn't know much English. I just learned a little bit of English in Algiers. And, well, this is a picture of a ship that I took from Algiers to the United States. It was a Liberty ship. And Liberty ships were built in 48 hours to support the troops in Europe fighting World War II. And they weren't made for passengers, so they could only take a few people. They only had a few cabins. And so we spent 21 days on a turbulent ocean before arriving in America. And there was a doctor on the ship who told us that sometimes the Liberty ships would break in half if the ocean was very rough. So I was always scared that that might happen and tried to be in the part of the ship that had the engine, because that's the only part that would get to America, he told us. Well, so there's a picture of a Liberty ship that broke in half during the journey. Next slide. So I lived with these relatives, and I was very eager to go to school right away. I hadn't had any schooling for 3.5 years, and I went to high school. When my mother arrived in America, we were very poor because the Nazis had taken away everything, all our possessions. My mother had never worked before, so she had to do unskilled labor. My brother took a job during the daytime and went to high school at night to finish school. And I went to school in the daytime and had after-school jobs. And during the summer, I worked in hotels in upstate New York, in resorts. That was a good job to have in the summer because you work 7 days a week from morning to night, and you don't have any chance to spend the money you earn. So then I would come home with $500-600, and that was a lot of money to help me to keep going to school. I was also very lucky because when I graduated from high school, I went to college. And city colleges in New York were tuition free. And if that hadn't been the case, I would never have been able to go to college because we were very poor at that time. The next slide. So after graduating from college, I went to Duke University and studied economics. For graduate students, there were assistantships, and so that paid for my tuition. And it took me, let's see, about 6 years, I think, to get my PhD. At Duke University, I met my husband, and we both got our PhDs in the 1960s, and eventually came to the University of Michigan. Both of us were on the faculty for more than 35 years. We've lived in Ann Arbor most of our lives. Next slide. So we started a family, and these are my children who went to Tappan when they were young, but now they have their own children. And this is the next slide. I have 2 granddaughters and 1 grandson, and now we have 3 great-grandchildren. So a wonderful family. Unfortunately, they all live far away, but we get to see each other once in a while. Next slide. I'm teaching economics at the University of Michigan. My PhD was in economics. And the next slide, that is a historic picture, because here I was on the faculty of the School of Public Health, and this is graduation day of my department, and you can see the front row are all the graduates, and they're all white males. They wear suits and white shirts and ties. And then behind them is all the faculty, and they're white males, and they're wearing suits, white shirts and ties. And then over in the corner on the right, that's me. And so I'm the only woman in the department. This was the 1970s. And if I was to show you the picture today, then probably more than half the graduates would be women, and it would be a much more diverse population with different races, ethnicities, and other differences. And the faculty also would probably consist 30% of women. So this was a different time, and it's good to remember that there have been substantial changes since that time. And that's why I showed this picture, because the world you see is very different today. Next slide. And so my brother also had has two children. And one time at a family reunion, his children and my children wanted us to take them on a trip to see the sites of family history. And first we were kind of shocked because my brother and I had never considered going back to these places, the places of horror and suffering. But then we decided if we wouldn't take our children, then who would? So we went, and here we are. It's 1991. We are at Bergen-Belsen. Next slide. And so here you see a mass grave. When the Allies came to liberate the camp, Bergen-Belsen, they found 30,000 dead bodies all over the grounds. And they couldn't think of a different way but digging these big trenches and burying people. And so this stone here indicates that there are 500. What is it?
5,000.
5,000 dead bodies in this grave. And then if you were to visit Bergen-Belsen, you would find these mass graves, quite a few of them, in this territory. And then it's the slide on the right side is a gravestone for Anna Frank and her sister. They both died in Bergen-Belsen, and they must have been buried in a mass grave. But then after the war, relatives and friends could come and place a gravestone there in memory of Anna and Margot Franken. You can see a lot of people have visited, and they leave little items in front of the gravestone, in either stones or little dolls or some jewelry, and that became a custom. Next slide. So after Bergen-Belsen, we went to visit the great gravesite of my father. He is buried in a Jewish cemetery in Germany, near the town where he was taken off the train. And I have been there a number of times, and this is a place that my granddaughters have visited, and maybe great-grandchildren at some point may visit. And I've made friends with the people who take care of the cemetery. I've been there 6 times, and it is a wonderful connection to know that my father wasn't buried in a mass grave, but he has his own place in the cemetery. And there were 3 other people buried in the cemetery who were also on the train from Bergen-Belsen. Next slide. So here we have what is called Stolperstein. And this is a German sculptor started this idea of placing these stones for people who were murdered by the Nazis during World War II. And they're all over Europe now. There are maybe 70,000 of these stones have been placed. Many of them by the sculptor himself. He's getting old now, but he said he will install these stones until he dies. And it has the name of the person and their date of birth, and then where they were deported to and where they died. And so the house on the left there, that is the house where my father was born and he grew up. And in front of that house is his Stolperstein that was placed there. And then the ones on the bottom are my grandparents, they were also deported to a camp in Czechoslovakia. And there, Stolperstein are in front of the house where they lived before they were deported from Berlin. And this is a beautiful momentum to remember the names of people who were murdered during the Holocaust and either burned in the gas ovens or buried in mass graves. So if you preserve the name of a person, then there's a chance that that person will be remembered by subsequent generations. Next slide. And so this is a quote by Elie Wiesel. He's not alive anymore. He survived Auschwitz. And he was a leader of Holocaust survivors. And one day I heard him say this. I heard him on the radio, and it's this quote. And he said, if you were there, if you were in the camps, and you breathed the air and heard the silence of the dead, then you must continue to bear witness to prevent the dead from dying again. And that statement had a great impression on me, and that's why I made it a mission to tell the story as much as I can. Next slide. And so later on, I decided that while I had been a victim during the Holocaust, I wanted to think of myself as a survivor. Because when you're a victim, you're weak, you're powerless, you have to submit yourself to forces that want to kill you. And when you're a survivor, you're strong and you're powerful and you can become active. And so I got involved in some peace work. And one of my projects is to keep alive the memory of Raoul Wallenberg. He was a Swede. He went to the University of Michigan from 1931 to 1935. And he's now remembered on campus of the university. And there you see the Wallenberg Medal. Each year, a humanitarian is invited to come here and to tell us about the wonderful deeds that they are doing to protect the people who are being persecuted and to save people from persecution and to protect refugees and to do all kinds of humanitarian projects. Also, environmental justice is a big issue now. And so the next slide shows some of the people who have received the Wallenberg Medal. One of them is the Dalai Lama. He is a Buddhist priest who is the leader of the Tibetan people, and he's very well known. He works for peace, he teaches compassion, and he came to the University of Michigan. He got the Wallenberg Medal. Next slide. Here is Brian Stevenson. He has devoted his life to freeing innocent prisoners who are on death row, and he does a lot of amazing work. And then there is the woman from Mexico.
Lydia Cacho.
Lydia Cacho, she also came here and won the medal. She protects people, women who have been abused, and also she is involved in trafficking of women all over the world. She's written a book. And then you see there, Meek Peace. She was the person who sheltered the Frank family, Anne Frank and her family, and she came here to receive the medal. I had never met her before, but she's an amazing person. She died at age 100 a few years ago, and she said that she doesn't want to be thought of as a hero because it is a human duty to help others. And that was her philosophy. She wouldn't have chosen any other way. And then there's John Lewis, and he was a very committed fighter for rights of all people, and he was a representative in Congress and did a lot of very dangerous work to fight for the rights of, especially voting rights for black people. So those are all the people, just a few people that we've had. More than 20 Wallenberg lecturers who come to campus and serve as role models for the Ann Arbor community. The next slide is a group that I helped found. It's called Zaytuna, which means olive tree or olive branch in Arabic. And the group consists of 6 Palestinian women and 6 Jewish women. And we work for a just peace. And we use dialogue as a method. We spend more than 1 year just listening to each other's stories, getting to know each other. And here we are on the march for peace and justice. And we are 20 years old. We meet every other week in our homes. And our motto is refusing to be enemies. And that's what we practice, and we serve as role models for not thinking of people who are different as others, but refusing to be enemies by getting to know other people and enriching our lives by becoming familiar with other cultures and other histories. The next slide. Well, this is the lessons I like to transmit. First of all, refusing to be enemies, to be open to anybody who is a human being, no matter what their religion, what their ethnicity, what their color, what their gender, refusing to be enemies, and your lives will become enriched. Then one person can make a difference. And sometimes the problems are so large, and we think we're so small, and so we just turn our back to the problem. But everybody can make a difference, whether it's small or whether it's larger at some other point in time. Don't walk away when you see injustice, when you see something is unfair, when you see bullying on the playground. Don't turn your back, but do something about it. And then never be a bystander. Well, I've already said it. Don't turn your back to things that are wrong, but become an activist, become a change person. And all of us can work to build a better world. And I think, well, this is just a cover of my book, From Holocaust to Hope, Shores Beyond Shores. And it's available on Amazon. It's been translated into four languages and sold in a number of other countries.